course, we have focused on the grass-based and grazing component, being the North Dakota Grazing Lands Coalition. And with that, I think one of the important things that we've moved towards in the years past is we've really gotten back to the basics of looking at soil and looking at soil health and the role that it plays in terms of the entire system. And of course, we heard that from Dr. Teague this morning. Well, now we're going to swing the pendulum to the other end of the spectrum, and we're going to talk about the human health component of that. And I think that it's a good reminder for all of us that even though we can get pretty involved in our daily workload in terms of moving livestock or planting crops or managing our ecosystem at the ground level, ultimately what we're producing is hopefully high quality, nutrient dense foods that were not only for our own family but for a lot of other people, individuals, families, that sort of thing. So with that, we decided this year to incorporate someone who could speak more to the human health component, but still connect it back to soils, plants, animals, and how that whole complex, that whole interface comes together. So this afternoon, our first speaker is Kalie Rider. Kalie is a registered dietitian who learned the importance of nutrition firsthand after a personal health crisis with autoimmune disease. Her specialty revolves around nutrition as it pertains to children, how we grow food, and how culture in the land influences our food choices. She researched grass-fed beef from the perspective of nutrition and the soil in graduate school at the University of Montana. She currently lives on her brother's ranch outside of Williston, North Dakota, and practices nutrition counseling in Trenton, North Dakota, the northwestern part of the state. Kalie will speak on soil and health and why it matters to our family. Please welcome Kalie.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks for having me here today. I really, after I learned about this organization last year, I really like what it stands for, and I really like being a part of it. So my talk is called Soil and Human Health, Why It Matters to Our Family. Here today is my brother Jed. I don't really claim him all the time, but you guys know he did a talk last year. My sister Joni, my sister-in-law Melissa, and we've kind of adopted a way of life around food, and that's what I want to talk about today. And this is the first time I've used this thing. Okay, so when Josh asked me specifically what I was going to talk about with nutrition, I was like, I can go in a lot of different ways. I can talk about the science. I can talk about the current conversations around, beef. I can talk about the statistics of what's happening in our country in terms of health. I can talk about the historical and cultural perspective. Or I can talk about how I counsel my patients. Like, I'm sure a lot of you would be interested to know when a patient comes in to me and eats a lot of red meat, what do I tell them? And I'm going to touch on all these things, but it was like, how am I going to frame it? That's what I was wondering. And this is kind of the view. I live at Jed's ranch, and I live in the tack room of his pole shed or whatever, and that's just kind of how you have to live in the Bakken. You just kind of have to find a roof over your head somehow. And Christmas morning, I walk over. We have brunch. That is what we do for Christmas, is have an awesome brunch. And we take out some of Dessa's pork. She's going to be speaking next. And we fry up some of Jed's pastured eggs, and it's all in the pork fat. Or we fry the potatoes also in the pork fat, and it's just like super nutritious food. You might think that's strange coming from a dietitian saying that. So basically what it boiled down to, like after kind of that moment, and Jed, Melissa, and I were talking after that, like, really, what am I all about? And that's how I want to frame it today, like how I live my life today and why. What brought me here to this moment? So I'm going to start, first I want to show you this soil to plate continuum is what I call it. Production, distribution. Distribution kind of encompasses transportation and processing. And consumption. Like, this is a continuum. I'm a very visual person, so I'm going to be bringing this back in a lot. So first, my roots. That's my grandpa Bob. My sister and my mom are photographers, so I have some cool pictures. Both my grandpas were sugar beet farmers in the Missouri Valley outside of Williston. My dad was a sugar beet farmer too. He ended up losing his farm in the farm crisis. And this is a picture that I just unearthed recently. That's my mom and dad and my sister and I twirling in front of our house like upon foreclosure. I had no idea this picture even existed or that this interview even happened. So this just this all kind of comes into play. And then you can see the North Dakota farms decline down there too. And what happened basically in the 80s with everybody losing their farms. And on the nutrition side, like that was kind of growing up in the production world. On the nutrition side, I had an early interest in nutrition. I was always the sickly one. I had extreme anxiety, low energy, reactions to food, especially sugar. Sugar gave me debilitating migraines. And I felt good when I ate fresh food. So my mom and dad would let me go to the grocery store and buy like vegetables and chop them. And like that's, like I just preferred to eat that way naturally because it didn't make me sick. Also, my great-grandma Alpha, she would say things like, you are what you eat, food is medicine, food before pills, and she fostered in me an early interest in the healing power of food. And therefore, in college, I studied nutrition. I got my bachelor's degree in dietetics. I loved it. I had great professors, I had great classmates, I went to really great school. I began to understand how to use food to heal my body, and I loved all of that. Coming from a farming community, I developed a special interest in the connection between agriculture and nutrition. And that special interest kind of turned into a major frustration because I saw this connection, I experienced this connection, but everything was so absolutely disconnected. The production people were in their bubble talking about production, the consumption and nutritionists, they were in their bubble, and the distribution people were in their bubble, and they were kind of the ones making all the money out of the deal. All the processing and transportation people. I call this the soil to plate hodgepodge of disconnection. It is no longer a continuum of any kind. This led to what I would call my falling out with nutrition. I realized how the majority of the conversation about food and nutrition had nothing to do with the people or the land and the people who provided it. I realized the profession was very geared towards what I would call disease management nutrition instead of preventative nutrition, like the nutrition, like the way my great-grandma talked about it. And also there was obsession with the perfect diet. And an example of what I would call disease management nutrition, if you have diabetes, you count your carbs. You have heart disease, you watch your cholesterol and saturated fat, liver disease, protein, kidney disease, this. Where is the prevention here? Once you get a disease, then we talk to you. How do we prevent disease? And also from the obsession with the perfect diet, like, you know, all these, the nutritionists and the dietitianists and the research world on that side, we were like, just wanted to find the perfect diet and it would dominate the conversation. And this is like just another example, like all these things just take over the entire conversation and, the, you know, farmers and land and farm, they just don't exist. And then I really can't stand calorie counting, so I'm gonna put that as the most annoying like piece of it all. I wanted to be part of the solution, not the Band-Aid. I wanted to help to create a food system that promoted healthy communities and healthy attitudes about food instead of a food system that created individuals who get sick and then undergo lifelong personal battles with calories, protein, fat, carbs, sodium. So I did a 180. I went to grad school, University of Montana. I learned how to change policy to create healthier communities, like changing regulations to make it easier for small-scale processing, giving communities easier access to products grown or raised within communities. And it was interesting, a lot of things Annie Carlson said earlier today was kind of resonated. She was talking about the challenges she personally experiences. The Department of Ag, poultry processing, large-scale animal processing, the health department, licensing and fees, all that stuff. Like what the people I know at the University of Montana, they're trying to make those regulations so that they are easier for the small guy. So that's kind of the distribution side of things. I learned about 4-season vegetable farming and gardening. She talked about the CSA. I learned how to make or use greenhouses, high tunnels, and use cold season crops to have more year-round, fresh, healthy food. Production side. So this is a food systems approach instead of like the one-on-one counseling approach after somebody is already sick. And I had to write all this out, otherwise I wouldn't say it right. So the gist of food system thinking. When healthy food is high quality, affordable, and readily available, we gravitate to eating healthier and make better choices when faced with less healthy options. When healthy food is sad-looking, sparse, and expensive, and disease-promoting food is cheap, readily available, and addictive, we as a society and a culture will be unhealthy no matter how much we discuss the perfect diet. So I created, instead of a continuum, a soil-to-table pyramid. If you have a really strong foundation at the production and distribution end, healthy people just kind of happen. We don't have to argue about the perfect diet or whatever, it just kind of happens. And so I found my people. This is where I wanted to be. I wanted to be on the production side. I didn't like being in hospitals. I liked being outside. This is where I belonged, and I figured it out. And I don't know about you guys, but the second I think I have things figured out in life, something comes out and just pulls that rug out from under me. And it says, just kidding, and that's exactly what happened. I got really, really sick. I tore my ACL playing basketball. Pretty minor surgery you have, I got a staph infection with that. And I was put on extremely high-dose, heavy-duty antibiotics. Antibiotics I was on, they call them last resort, because they only use them for the last resort. I was in and out of the hospital, I was on home health, all this kind of stuff. So the high dose of antibiotics killed all the bacteria in my body. It led to severely imbalanced gut bacteria. I'm sure some of you out here have been hearing some of this. It's really big, the gut and the connection between everything. That led to a suppressed, malfunctioning immune system. And given that 70% of our immune system is in our digestive tract, my immune system was completely out of whack when my gut became out of whack. If all of these are left unchecked, if this cycle is left unchecked, it can turn into a full-blown autoimmune disorder depending on how bad you're out of balance. So I'm going to briefly explain autoimmune disease. What does that even mean? Autoimmune disease is a disease in which the immune system attacks healthy cells. And these are examples: celiac disease, irritable bowel disease, eczema, allergies, psoriasis. I'm sure you guys know somebody or personally experience one of these. And what we do in the medical world is when your immune system is all messed up, we give you a steroid to suppress the immune system, just to make it work less so that it doesn't continue to attack your body. Well, from this other perspective, you heal your gut. It's just much harder to do that, and it takes a much longer amount of time, so it's a lot easier to go the steroid route. So remember this statement? I wanted to help to create a food system instead of being a part of the system that created individuals who get sick. Well, I became that individual. I had to undergo this lifelong personal battle with all of these things. And to this day, it's a day in and day out thing that I have to do, and it kind of defines me. I don't like that it defines me, but it's kind of been beneficial in other ways that you'll see down the road here. So back in grad school, I had to come to terms again with nutrition. I fell back into the conversation about nutrition in the body. I discovered a new conversation blossoming in the autoimmune community. And grass-fed beef and pastured animals in general were at the center of that conversation. I found out that the ultimate healing foods for my messed up immune system were the fats, proteins, and nutrients found in healthy pastured animals. I listened to lectures, I read a ton of books by autoimmune specialists, and they basically prescribed eating this way. It was part of their prescription for people. I ate this way for a year with much success, and then decided to look at the hard science of grass-fed beef for my master's thesis. Everything kind of started coming together. So in the same way that my other continuum is kind of disconnected, so is this. The soil scientists don't talk to the animal scientists who don't talk to the nutrition scientists. They just stay in their bubbles. I wanted to see if there was hard science out there that connected the bubbles. And I'll go more into it, but my conclusion was, when pastures have maximum head that are properly grazed, it drastically improves soil health. When cows are raised and finished on pasture, they are much healthier animals and require less medical input. When cows are finished on grass, they have a more favorable fatty acid profile than when they are finished on grain, which is like feedlot style, you know, like a ton of grain, not a little bit of grain, like a ton of grain. And what does fatty acid profile mean? Like, what is another way of saying that last sentence? The balance of fats in the meat of grass-finished cows are less likely to promote inflammation than if the cows were finished on an intensive grain-based diet. I don't know if you guys have been hearing a lot about inflammation in the press at all, but as a health professional, there are two things I really want to get across today, and that is the role of inflammation in our bodies and the role of digestion. Those are the two main things that are kind of happening with human health right now. So I'm going to explain it. What is inflammation and why care about it? It's the physiological response that acts to heal our bodies when injured. It promotes the formation of blood clots that aid and repair damaged tissues. So say you cut off a finger. Your body puts out all these chemical processes to fix that finger. And I just saw my sister make a motion. She actually cut the tip of her finger off this year. So her body went into this emergency mode. It sent a ton of things to make that bleeding stop. And then it goes away. Once it creates that clot, it goes away. And that's how inflammation acts in our bodies. That's how it's supposed to act. It becomes unnatural when it is constantly triggered by food. The standard American diet is very high in foods that promote inflammation. Sugar, refined grains, highly processed vegetable oils, and junk foods. This creates a hyperactive systemic inflammatory response that doesn't get a chance to shut off. So instead of this big fire going and fixing it and then turning off, it's a ton of tiny little fires in your body that never go away. This is what we call chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation either leads to chronic conditions or it exacerbates any kind of chronic condition that you're already experiencing. So, these are just an example of all the different things chronic inflammation leads to. Diabetes, pulmonary disease, bone and joint disease, metabolic disorders, autoimmune disorders. So if you have digestion and inflammation problems happening at the same time, it's just kind of bad. Cardiovascular disease and all kinds of cancer. So obviously, chronic inflammation affects everything basically that we're dealing with in the United States as far as sickness. I need to talk about the misconceptions about fat because every patient that comes into me, that's I have to completely deconstruct their idea about fat because of how fat has been in the press and been recommended for the past 50 years. Fat got a bad rap beginning in the 60s, but research was far from solid. However, that far from solid research was lobbied super hard and it became widespread recommendations. Dietary guidelines warned against eating fat, primarily saturated fat and cholesterol. Animal fats got replaced with highly processed vegetable oils and hydrogenated oils. I'm sure you've heard of trans fats, because they contained no saturated fat or cholesterol, so they were fair game all of a sudden. And they also got replaced with processed sugar and grains because they were lower in calories and they also didn't contain lots of cholesterol or saturated fat. So people thought they found the secret to health. Only to find that these fats and sugar were more inflammatory than the fats they replace. So it didn't really work out. And not all saturated fats are created equal. For example, the lauric acid in coconut oil, it's a saturated fat, but it's been proven now to have a ton of super beneficial properties. Grass-finished beef has higher concentrations of stearic acid as a saturated fat than grain-finished beef. And stearic acid actually has a benign effect on cholesterol, they found. It doesn't really do anything. However, grain-finished beef, the more grain that it's finished on, the more higher concentrations of types of saturated fat that have that are inflammatory. So I won't go into much more science than that. I have some graphs though, increase in obesity, and I don't like talking about things in terms of weight, but these are how these graphs are framed. So the increase in obesity since implementation of low-fat guidelines. You guys can see where the low-fat guidelines begin and the sharp rise in obesity since we told people to stop eating fat. Sugar consumption and obesity prevalence. So you can see that extremely direct relationship between sugar and obesity. Replacing traditional fats with highly processed oils. And the two that you can see that are kind of dipping down, that's the butter and lard. And then the margarine, the shortening, and the oils, which basically have only been around for the past 50 years. You can see exactly where they came on, or I guess it's 60 years. Those have gone up exponentially. So a big passion of mine is the health of children. And one thing that I came across in my research is these new statistics about children that are coming out. Obesity rates have doubled in children in the past 10 years. 1 in 3 children are expected to have diabetes. That's nuts. 1 in 3. If you're a minority, it's 1 in 2. Half of our children are expected to have diabetes. Or, well, if you're a minority, but whatever. For the first time in recorded history, the up-and-coming generation of kids have a life expectancy shorter than the generation prior due to the emergence of chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. So from everything I told you today, you can see how autoimmune disease and inflammation plays a huge role in all that. So these are kind of really depressing statistics. Around this time, I decided to move home for a variety of reasons. The probably biggest reason was I was still really sick and broke because I had a bunch of medical bills and school bills. So if you're sick and broke, it's really good to be around your family. My brother was getting into planned grazing and soil regeneration, and it was just too much of a coincidence. Like, he was getting into it from the soil end, I was obsessing over it from the nutrition end and doing this big research project about the soil to plate, you know? So I wanted to take advantage of that on some level, be around it. I was an autoimmune patient and I wanted access to his beef. Like, the whole autoimmune community that I read about online, a lot of them are from the city, most of them are from the city, and they would give a kidney to have access to what I have access to at my brother's ranch. Like, I get so excited that we have a freezer full of grass-fed beef, like, right outside the tack room. It's amazing. I wanted to use my knowledge and experience to give the next generation of kids in my family the best chance in health amidst all these gloomy, depressing statistics. I had the knowledge and experience, you know, like, I was in Missoula at the time, where they pretty much deliver local food to your door if you want it. And we don't have that kind of access at home, and I knew I could be a part of changing that. Along came Oliver. Oliver changed a lot of us. Like, I mean, I can do whatever I want for my body, but when a kid gets sick, it really changes things. And this is my sister's son. I was her nanny at the time, and she had Oliver. He was born with horrible eczema and a multitude of food allergies. His body was highly inflammatory. This is Oliver. His eczema was so bad, he was constantly itching to the point of bleeding. I don't know if you can tell up on his forehead, but he has lots of like scabs. Through my own struggle with autoimmune disease, I was able to help Oliver find the right specialist. We worked on healing his gut and therefore healing his immune system. Oliver was never put on steroids. And that's Oliver today. 5 years later. And I mean, his skin is super soft, and every once in a while he has eczema, but it's a daily battle with Oliver, just like me. Day in and day out, we have to follow an incredibly strict diet to rebuild his body. It's kind of like regenerating soil, like all these other things that I hear you guys talk about. My sister and I were just saying earlier, like, it just sounds like how we address bodies. And our family friend Shelby is here today. I told you my mom and my sister are photographers. Well, Shelby came in for dance pictures and she brought this little boy in. My mom instantly was like, you need to go talk to Joni. That's my sister, Joni. And this is what he looked like. And Shelby was an awesome mom. Like, prior to talking to Joni, she was doing everything she can to help Burke. This is Burke. And Joni put her in touch with the same specialist that we were in touch with. Like, my knowledge only goes so far. Like, what I'm good at is, putting people in the right direction. And that was day 1, day 6, day 14 of following these recommendations from this specialist. And this was him just a couple months later. And this is at Burke today. So you can just see like the power of nutrition in these photos. I don't know about you guys, but this is what my family tree looks like. And this is like in our immediate family. This is all the stuff that we're constantly dealing with. And I'm sure, given the statistics, that many of you have the same looking family tree. So we as a family, like our generation, me, Joni, and Jed, we just kind of asked ourselves, how can we change this trajectory? Kind of for us, but more so for the next generation. How do we change it for the kids? And where does the land and soil fit into all this? So the USDA just came out with their dietary guidelines, and I decided I wanted to come up with my own. This is what my family practices now. Increase high-quality proteins and fat from pastured beef, lamb, pork, chicken, bison, eggs, grass-fed dairy, coconut oil, olive oil, and it's really awesome. Right now we have beef from Jed, lamb from Tim Szymanski, who's going to talk, pork from Dessa, and then we have our own eggs. And I have Hutterite chickens. I just love this lifestyle. And the next thing that we do is increase fruits and vegetables generally. The more local, the better, but there's not a ton of local vegetable farming in Western North Dakota right now, so you just kind of do what you got to do. Minimize processed foods. This is a basic. You can really go into the complications of all this, but this is basically what we strive for. Like refined sugar, sugary drinks, refined carbohydrates, and processed vegetable oils. And this basically boils down to increasing whole foods, decreasing processed foods. And this is a lot like the way my great-grandma, she just used to eat this way. It wasn't all weird to eat this way at one point. That's what people used to have access to. I created this continuum, this spectrum, because the further you get to the whole food side, the more expensive, the more impractical, and the more crazy you appear to everybody else. Everyone thinks you're kind of off your rocker. And so it's just not practical for a lot of people. And most of my patients I work with, it is totally impractical. They can't go there. But the further you go that way, the more anti-inflammatory it becomes, the more it improves your gut health, the more it strengthens your immune system. And it's just the opposite the more you go towards processed foods. And the goal is to not have to be all the way at that end all the time. The goal is you have a strong enough gut that it can handle more of the processed foods, not a lot of processed foods, but more. Like my body and Oliver's body and Burke's body, they kind of need to be far at that other end, unless resorting to steroids. So if you can afford it, if you can make the time, that's how I want to live. And another thing I was thinking about when you guys were talking was it's kind of like grass versus corn. The more you increase the corn in cows, the more you're getting into maybe having to medicate them, maybe they're sicker more often or whatever, and the more they just stay on how their biology was designed, to eat grass, the healthier they are. And I don't know if it's cool to compare us to cows, but that's a good comparison. So I'm going to talk about Jed's perspective for a second. His whole point in life now, he likes the word regenerate. He doesn't like the word sustainable anymore, because the corporate people are kind of taking it. It's regenerating soil health. He wants to teach his kids about soil from the get-go. We weren't taught that way. We just were around sugar beets. He wants to teach his kids about the bigger picture from the get-go. It's not just about growing and selling food. It's about stewardship. It's about providing healthy food to our to our family and our community. He calls it high management, low input operation. And in the crazy ups and downs of the commodity market, work towards having something more resilient to pass on to his boys. So that's his perspective from the soil health side. You guys heard this whole presentation about my perspective from the family health side, and that's my diagram for that. There's a lot of crossover, and it's about strengthening our family. So I think I kind of burned through this presentation fast, I don't know, but this is my last slide. The bottom line is, you know, all these people like to say, like as humans, I think we just like to stay in our comfortable little bubbles. I never had that opportunity. You know, I was raised on a farm or in a farming community. I started learning about the consumption end, and then I got like really jaded with that, and so I wanted to be on the production end, and then I got sick, and I was back on the consumption end again, or the nutrition end, and then I found out that it was like how we produce food that is truly was healing bodies right now. So it's like, to me, it's obviously all connected. And another thing I wanted to say is I don't really like being preachy about this stuff at all. Like when I have my patients, I want to educate them and then they can make their own choices. And you know, that's how I want to be. And today I wanted it to be like, this is what I do and this is why I do it. And this is what my family's doing. And you can take it or leave it type of thing. So, yeah, I guess that's it. Does anybody have questions? Oh.
I'd like your opinion on the role of fermented foods, natural yogurts, sauerkraut, kimchi, and stuff like that, as part of maintaining a healthy internal biome.
Well, the autoimmune community and actually the nutrition community is big time starting to come around to that. Really believes that it's crazy. It's like some of the best health food out there is any kind of fermented food. And fermented food that isn't then like heated, you know, like pickles that are brine pickles versus vinegar pickles, because it has naturally occurring bacteria in it. So that was like probiotics before probiotics were a thing. Like people just ate them because that's the only option they had to preserve food. And they didn't realize that they were like constantly like giving their body a ton of good bacteria.
Question over here.
Yeah. I have a question. Did you, in your research, did you see any correlation between eating the grass-fed and lower incidence of depression? Because it seems that we have a lot of, and since we moved to North Dakota, you know, a few years ago, it seems like everybody's on something, and we should be the healthiest people over here, you know, with all the land and so on. So, is there any correlation between the healthy fats and so on?
You know, I haven't looked at that specifically. I can say though that a lot of my counseling jobs have been with Indian Health Service on the reservations, and I have a particular interest in traditional foods. And I looked up the science, a lot of the science between going back to a traditional diet within the Native community and the impact. And there's huge correlations. And that's more of a well-researched community. Like there's a special interest there that people like to research. So there is a correlation, a huge correlation between mental health and going back to a traditional diet. And I would say that that's probably true for a lot of us. If we got off of, you know, more processed foods and lived more of generally a traditional lifestyle, whether you're Norwegian or Native or whatever, because there's a ton of crossover between all these traditional cultures, that you'd probably see a less incident in all mood disorders.
Other questions for Kalie?
What do you think about those athletic power shakes that is a meal and it's supposed to have like all of your nutritions with your vegetables, proteins, and also soy?
Okay, so I'm like, should I answer this as a registered dietitian or as me? The autoimmune crowd and the traditional foods crowd aren't huge fans of soy, unless it's fermented, because traditional cultures didn't eat soy. They ate it only when it was fermented. it's like they knew something about soy. Like the more they fermented it and broke it down that way, the more their bodies would tolerate it. As far as the powders go, if you have a strong enough system, like I can't do powders because there's all these random things in there and I react to random things and I can't isolate what it is that I'm reacting to. And there's better powders out there than others. Like it's just about finding the reputable companies and seeing if your body tolerates it, I guess. So I think that there are better, like Amazing Grass actually has a lot of, or wait, that's what it's called, right? Amazing Grass powders are a really good protein powder company as far as I understand. And they're they're all about grass-fed, that whole company, they're out of Nebraska, so I think, or Kansas or something.
Okay, Bruce. Is there any processed food that you feel you can't eat? Like, for instance, if you go into a natural food store and they got all this food that's supposed to be good for you, natural, and I've always thought that was just expensive processed food. I mean,
right.
Is it pretty much got to be you make it from scratch kind of stuff?
Well, it's kind of going back to that spectrum. You know, like the more it starts as a whole plant, the closer it is to the ground, the better it's going to be for you, unless you have an allergy or an intolerance to a whole food. Like Oliver, we would make these perfect, impeccable whole food meals that he would react like crazy to. You'd want to pull out your hair because he couldn't communicate to us what's happening. So it just depends on how your body is tolerating the whole foods. And if you have, so I like to call it a digestive fire. If you have this digestion system that has like really good, that's never been damaged, that, you can eat anything, a lot of people call it like an iron stomach, then you might be able to handle more of the processed foods. But even in a natural food store, like if it's heavily processed, and like it's still probably gonna affect your body, like if it's, at Albertsons or something, so. I don't know, I was kind of all over the place on that one, but.
Other questions?
So what damages your digestive system? I know antibiotics do, but is there anything else?
I think the three main ones that people talk about are stress, antibiotics, and sugar or refined carbohydrates. And a lot of us are like having that happen, all three of it, that at the same time. So it's easy for even like the average person to get out of balance. So yeah, those are the three main ones. I think there can be more than that, like ibuprofen and that kind of stuff. If you're on that a lot, that can damage your stomach in a different kind of way, so.
Early on, you said a reduction in cholesterol from natural sources was detrimental. And a lot of people are fed cholesterol-lowering medications, statins and things like that. Are they part of the problem?
I am not an expert on that. So what you're saying is actually lowering your cholesterol is detrimental and all the statins. Well, I haven't researched that heavily, so I can't really speak to that, but some stuff that I've read is that one of the ways that statins actually act on our bodies is actually they're anti-inflammatories. So they reduce the inflammation in our bodies. And one thing that I've been researching more lately is that cholesterol isn't the problem, it's inflammation. Cholesterol actually goes to repair inflammation in your bodies. So if you have high cholesterol, that might mean that you have a ton of inflammation happening. So we're saying the cholesterol is the bad guy, but they're actually like the firemen going to the fire. And I haven't looked into a lot of that either, but I think it makes a lot of sense from what I've read.
I was just going to ask you, I grew up in a community that's probably 80% grain farmers, and this conversation comes up a lot about GMOs and non-GMOs and organic and what's better, and I just kind of want to get your take on that.
Oh, geez. I was staying away from that on purpose. I think that's super complex. That is a super complex conversation. I can talk about it from the perspective of sugar beets, because almost overnight, sugar beets went from being non-GMO to GMO. I don't like it from the seed control perspective more than anything. You can argue about whether or not it affects allergies. You can argue about a lot of that stuff. But like when somebody patents a seed and then has complete control over that, and then they can, you know, they almost have a patent on all the seeds because now everybody's growing Roundup Ready sugar beets all of a sudden. That makes me uncomfortable. I think that needs to be questioned. I think that takes control away from the individual family farmers. So I can talk to you later about the other side if you want.
I think one thing that needs to be mentioned is that all these GMOs, I mean, one of the purposes is to be glyphosate or herbicide tolerant, and herbicides such as glyphosate are antibiotics, and they're highly selective. They kill your beneficial bacteria at 400 times lower concentrations than your pathogens. So, and it's in everything. So we are basically, unless we eat organic, we constantly kill our gut bacteria, and that leads to leaky gut syndrome. And I'm not even talking about, you know, the foreign DNA from mutant foods. So
I'll let him answer your question.
I have a question for you, Kalie. One of the things, and this is a conversation, not what we've just been talking about, but just how soil health crosses through the entire spectrum to human health. And one of the things that I've heard people like Dr. Fred Provenza talk about is how important it is from a human perspective to be able to read your body. And he calls it biodigestive feedback, in being able to understand your body. And he said one of the things that most people do is they just don't pay attention to that. It's not that they don't feel discomfort, but then they run to something to hide the symptom, which is something Dr. T talked about this morning, problem versus symptom. And just in terms of being able to read our own bodies and what it's trying to tell us, it's not really a question as much as I would like you to just maybe comment on that. You've obviously been very in tune to what your body's been telling you. What are some things that we can do to better read ourselves? What some key hitters to pay attention to, so to speak?
Heartburn's not natural. A lot of people think it's really natural to have heartburn all the time and then take antacids. Antacids, that's another thing you're asking about, like what messes up gut bacteria. Constant antacids are just, they do not do you any benefit. Any kind of digestive upset, like most of us think digestive upset is just like a way of life. But if you change your diet a little bit, you can heal all that without relying on medications. If that's something you care about, that's something I really care about, you know? That's something my family really cares about. So we're making lifestyle changes, and people kind of think we're crazy. Kind of like if you're changing your operation on your farm, like people think you're crazy for a while, and then sometimes they slowly come around. Another thing I wanted to say about that, another thing Annie Carlson said was she takes this, instead of this research-driven approach, she takes a holistic tinkering approach to her farm. That is exactly how I would describe what I do with my body and what we did with Oliver. It was like trial and error from our own tiny little experiment, like daily. So,
Going back to the indigestion thing, I've got reflux. Seems like when I eat spicy foods, I get really bad indigestion. But is it the spicy food? Do you think it's the spicy food that's giving me the indigestion? Or do you think the spicy food is aggravating the indigestion that I'm getting from something else?
Well, the dietitian side of me says it's the spicy food. Since I'm doing other kind of research, and honestly, I don't know what dietitians are saying today. I know that they've come a long way in terms of all of this. So I don't want to say that I don't agree with that community at all. But basically, it's gas in your stomach, from what I understand, that creates heartburn, because you have this little sphincter up here, and then when it opens into your throat, that's what creates the heartburn. And if there's any kind of pressure on that whatsoever, it opens. And so if you have gas created, and gas comes from like the fermentation of foods that you're not digesting very properly. So if you're eating a ton of like a highly processed grain-based diet or whatever, a lot of times you'll have a lot of fermentation that creates gas that puts pressure on that sphincter. So that's one possible answer to that, but I mean, we can't have a little counseling session in front of everybody, I don't think. So.
Okay, we'll take one more question here, and then maybe you need to set up a booth out in the hallway or something.
From what you've gone through and what you've helped others with, I would assume you would say that food has healed you. Is there, and then you also have your continuum of the costs involved with eating healthy. Is there anything done through some of the research or through the universities you've worked with to try and bring it to the general public or even just the scientific community that we don't necessarily need all these drugs, that food can heal us and that we need to make it good, healthy food more accessible rather than making drug companies more accessible?
I would say that conversation is growing exponentially. Some universities are doing it, and they're doing it really well. The University of Montana, the program I was in, they're doing an amazing grassroots type job on that, changing policy, making food more accessible. You know, having people use WIC or food stamps at farmers markets, for example. Like, that's starting to happen a lot more. But what I see happening, and when I saw changes happen drastically, like in our culture, was when social media happened. Like, suddenly I wasn't like the crazy girl who's been out in the world coming home and with all these crazy ideas. Everyone was sitting in their front of their computers and learning all this stuff on their own. And a lot of the scientific community, that makes them really uncomfortable, you know, like all these people having this information and doing whatever they want with it, you know, like it should come from the experts. And in my experience, I think it's been really good for people to share all that information and all their like tinkering